What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we are talking about all things exposure. It is quite the rainy day here in Houston. Actually, I see some blue sky, so I'm a little bit confused. In today's video, we're going to be talking about three main things: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So these three things combined determine whether or not your photo is going to be brighter or darker, and they have a very specific relationship with one another that determines how your photos come out. I know these videos can be monotonous and boring, and I wanted to try and make this as interesting and as digestible for you guys as possible. So with every single photo that you'll see today, I have shot in full manual mode, meaning I'm able to adjust each of these settings, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, independently of one another without adjusting the other settings. So with that being said, let's get into it, and we're gonna start off with aperture. So aperture is essentially, if you think of it in layman's terms, your pupil. When you're in a brighter setting, your pupil closes down and it gets smaller to let in less light because there's a lot of light coming in. On the other hand, if you're in a dark setting, if you're in a dark room or like a movie theater or something, you'll notice, like, you probably don't look at somebody's eyes very often, but in a dark setting, the pupils are really, really big because it's trying to let in as much light as possible so you can see in the dark. And basically, aperture on a camera works the same exact way. If it's really, really bright out, your aperture is going to be really closed down. If it's really dark in the room, you're going to want a wider aperture to let in more light. So with these three photos that I'm putting on the screen right now, the shutter speed and the ISO are both staying the same. The only thing changing between the three is the f-stop or the aperture. Another thing to note, the lower the number of the f-stop, the wider or the bigger the opening is. Just know that a lower number is going to allow for a wider opening, and a higher number is going to close down or allow for a smaller opening. We're starting off at an f1.4, which is as wide open as this lens will go. You'll see that it's pretty bright. You'll also notice that the background is very blurry. I'm focusing on that succulent there. Aperture has an effect on two primary characteristics of a photo. One, the overall exposure, because obviously if you're letting more light in, it's going to be brighter, and vice versa. If it's closed down, you're going to be letting less light in. And the depth of field. So basically it's how blurry your background is, or the bokeh. The wider open your lens is, the lower that f-stop, the more blurry that background is going to be, and vice versa. So you'll notice as you go through, the first photo here at 1.4 is going to be really creamy. The background is going to be really blurry, and the object you're focusing on is going to be very clear. So you're going to see a pretty clear distinction between the foreground or the object that you're focusing on and the background. So as we get to the third photo, you'll notice two main differences. One, you'll notice the photo is getting darker, and two, you'll notice the background is getting a little more clear. Now you have to look a little bit closer because the photo is getting darker, but if you see that diffuser right behind the succulent, it is getting much more clear just because that aperture is closing down and it's creating a wider depth of field. Now, the term depth of field basically just determines how wide your focus field is. So a shallower depth of field or a smaller or a shorter depth of field, all of those terms basically mean there's going to be more distinction between the actual object you're focusing on and the background. And on the other spectrum, a deep or wide depth of field basically means that there's not going to be as much distinction between the foreground and the background, and both are going to be more clear together instead of having that nice blurry background. So as you can see, those are your main differences between changing your aperture to be wide open or a very low number, or closed down and a very high number. So with aperture out of the way, let's move on to shutter speed. Just like with aperture, the shutter speed here is the variable that is changing, and aperture and ISO are staying the same. So with the first of the three photos here on the screen, we have a shutter speed of 30, the second photo in the middle, a shutter speed of 200, and the third photo is a shutter speed of 1000. With these numbers here, it's 1/30th of a second, 1/200th of a second, and then 1/1000th of a second. So another way to think of this is referring back to the eye. Just like with the aperture being the pupil and how wide that opening is, the shutter speed is basically your eyelid opening and closing. So if you imagine your eyes are shut, boom, open, close, you're not getting much light in there. You're not getting much information. And so with the slow shutter speed, you're going to be letting in more light. So your eyes are going to be open for longer, boom, and then close them. Or with a fast shutter speed, you're going to be open, close. Imagine with a longer shutter speed, you're going to be letting in more light. With a shorter or faster shutter speed, you're going to be letting in less light. So in this photo specifically, the primary function of shutter speed is determining how bright or how dark the photo is. Now, shutter speed is a small component to overall exposure. In other situations, shutter speed plays a big part in motion. And with a slow shutter speed, say you have a fast moving object, so you have a race car, you have somebody running by, if you have a very slow shutter speed, say 1/25th of a second, and you have a fast moving object, try taking a photo of it. You'll notice that there is a good amount of blur with that object just because that shutter speed is too slow. Now, if you speed it up to maybe 1/250th or 1/320th of a second or 1/1000th, you'll see that there's much less blur, and it's almost like you're freezing that object in time right there, instead of getting that little bit of motion. And depending on how creative you want to get, sometimes the motion blur is desirable, and other times you want it to just be clear, like you're freezing the person or object right there in the frame. So going back to these photos specifically, we are looking at shutter speed being a major determining factor in how bright or how dark the photo is. So on to the third and final factor when determining exposure, ISO. So the boring part, ISO, is what it stands for. It's the International Standardization Organization. I don't know exactly what that means, but essentially they determine how sensitive camera sensors are. So basically you don't need to know exactly what that stands for. Me personally, I just found out what it exactly stood for like a year ago. ISO, if you think about it, is adding fake light to your photo. It's increasing the sensitivity of your camera sensor to light. So what does this mean? Essentially, it means the higher the ISO, the brighter the photo, and the lower the ISO, the darker the photo. So some people ask me, can you increase the ISO to, like, let's say 16,000 or 32,000 or 64,000 and just have a brighter photo? You can, but what happens at that point is ISO at a high level also introduces what's called noise. And noise are those little grains in a photo that you'll see if it's really dark and you're trying to get a well-exposed photo and your aperture is super wide and your shutter speed is really slow, so it's letting in a lot of light. You're trying to get a good photo, so you're bringing up your ISO. Adding in that fake light is also going to add in that noise, which might not look too good in the end product. Now, if you're going for maybe a vintage looking photo or, you know, something that doesn't really need to be super crisp, adding a ton of ISO is okay in that certain situation. I tend to like to keep mine as low as possible. Every camera's sensitivity is a little bit different. Every camera handles ISO a little bit different. But me personally, on this camera that I'm shooting on, I like to keep mine below 3200 to 1600. So basically, I don't like to go above 3200 if at all possible. If I do for some reason have to go up higher than that, I just know I'm gonna have to remove that noise in post afterwards. So in these three photos here, you have an ISO of 100 in the first photo, an ISO of 800 in the second photo, and an ISO of 6400 in the third photo. Obviously, the photos are getting brighter as you get to the third, but if you notice, the third photo, the very bright one, is probably also grainy if you zoom in. So what I've done for you guys is added a Google Drive folder link below that'll contain all of the photos that I have posted in this video, so you guys can take a look, you can download them, you can look closer at really how each of these characteristics and each of these factors affect the overall exposure of a photo. So I hope this video helped. I know it was a very simplified version of how all of these factors work on their own and how they pertain to an overall exposure of a photograph. But comment below if you have any questions. I would be happy to help you guys out. Please feel free to check out that Google Drive link below. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and I will see you guys in the next one.